Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Wilkin, and we're looking at a passage from Exodus chapter 10. We're going to talk about God's patience and man's pride today. That's kind of where we're going to zero in. And one of the observations about mankind, it is difficult for us to be humble. But especially people who are in power, it's difficult. In Exodus chapter 10, verse 3, it says, God asked Pharaoh through Moses, how long will you refuse to submit to me? Submit uses this Hebrew word anya, which means to be humble. This particular verb only appears 76 times in the Hebrew Bible. And most often when you see it, it's translated for words like afflicted or defeated, but about 20 times it means to submit to one in authority. Usually that authority is God that is speaking of, to submit to, but twice the verb is used of submitting to other people. And the thing we have to understand is that humility is the key that runs through this story of the 10 plagues, or the intent for humility. It's present indirectly in each mention of Pharaoh's stubbornness or the hardness of his heart. You see, he refused to humble himself before God. And the introduction, though, of the plague of the locust is slightly different than the introduction of the other previous plagues. Other plagues mention the hardness of Pharaoh's heart after the plague was over with, but the plague of the locust begins with Pharaoh's stubbornness. There seems to be this literary device that indicates God's patience with Pharaoh has come to a close. So like God's mercy has come to an end, and that's probably a whole different podcast there. But Pharaoh's door of opportunity to repent seems to have already shut, as was indicated in the previous lesson, where the language of God, we talked about God hardened his heart. Now the way the plague of locusts is introduced further highlights this conclusion of God's mercy and his patience toward Pharaoh. It's interesting that the hardening of Pharaoh's heart here also included the hardening of the hearts of Pharaoh's officials. In verse 1 of chapter 10, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Return to Pharaoh and make your demands again. I have made him and his officials stubborn so I can display my miraculous signs among them. That's something we need to understand, and we'll dive into this a little bit deeper, but who you choose to follow has an impact on your spiritual life. And so whether we're talking about the heart of the king, the heart of a king, Pharaoh, his official advisors, it's the fact that pride resists, the pride of men resists from submitting to God. Pride is in opposition to God. It opposes God. It is the exact opposite of God's character. And there are some things you can know about pride. One, pride keeps people from turning to God. If you look in Second Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, it says, Then if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, that was a requirement for them to receive. You see, this attitude is required when people pray, when they're going to seek God, when they're looking for revival. Humility is important if we want to receive forgiveness and restoration. Pride also keeps God from reaching us. So James 4 and 6 says, he gives grace generously, as the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Pride seems to be this opposite, the opposite of grace, because grace is something we don't deserve. Pride is rooted in our own strength and accomplishments. It seems to be diametrically opposed to anything that would be given to us as a free gift, not based on our merit. That's what grace is. So God can't give grace to the proud because pride seeks only what is deserved or what is achieved. God opposes man's trust in his own accomplishments. God is pushing back. He's constantly pushing back in us depending on our own accomplishments. And so God asked Pharaoh, how long will you refuse to submit to me? Pharaoh's pride was against submitting to God, and it was a personal pride. Pharaoh's attitude was, I'm too great to submit to God. Why should I have to do that? Pharaoh's officials manifested a different kind of pride. So they asked Pharaoh, how long will you let this man hold us hostage? So they're speaking of Moses at this point. Don't you realize that Egypt lies in ruins? The pride the officials had is in their own comfort, their property, their future. Their attitude was, I'm too good for the condition that I'm in. I shouldn't be suffering like this. Both of these how long questions, right, are criticisms of Pharaoh. So how long will you let this man hold us hostage? And how long will you refuse to submit to me is what God asked. Mm. For some people, pride is personal, while others, pride is connected to things like comfort or money or convenience. The thing I know is that pride never leads us to submission to God. It is never something that's, okay, I'm prideful now, I want to submit myself to God. It's the opposite of it. So, Dylan, let's look at a couple of questions. Why is it so difficult for people to submit to God?
So I think it all boils down to a simple sentence, which is because we feel like we have all the answers. The obvious one is human pride. We feel like we know best. I have pride in what I think. I know what's best. What I say is correct. Right? I believe that I'm right over anybody else. So I think submitting to God is difficult, number one, because of pride. I think you also have fear of change as well. You know that when you submit to God, that things are going to change. They're not going to stay the way that they're staying, because the reason why you're submitting to God is because you're doing something that is not necessarily far from God, but the opposite of necessarily something that He's wanting you to do. You're submitting to His will, right? Next is cultural influences, I think, and that's been a theme that I think I've talked about in every single one of these, is just people and society. It promotes self-reliance, individualism, personal freedom, which is the exact opposite of submitting to God. And then I just think also a misunderstanding of God's nature, kind of what we were talking about yesterday with Him being punitive rather than being merciful and loving, right? They misunderstand who God truly is, mm-hmm. and so they don't want to submit to His authority.
Can you point to a time where you think pride manifested itself in your own life?
Yeah, there was and I bring up my roughest time in life was during my middle school years, and that was just where I was so far from God. Again, I didn't want anything to do with Him. I was really, really far away, and I was prideful in myself, and that's why I said here that it's just because I felt like I had all the answers. Everything that I was doing, I was more happy doing that, and so I had a lot of pride in that area, and it was just I knew what was best, and God didn't. And which obviously isn't true, but that's what I believed at the time.
I have to tell you, I'm sitting here like semi-dismayed right this minute, and you talking about pride in middle school and that being the most difficult time of your life, because I'm doing some math. All right, so half of my life ago, mm-hmm. I was almost 29. I was pastor in my first church. I had 2 kids. I had a business. Half of your life ago, you were in the 5th grade.
It's very true.
That is this is concerning to me right here as I'm sitting here thinking about this. You know, it's semi-funny, but, you know, the reality is when we give illustrations, they are absolutely contextual, mm-hmm. right? And the thing about it, when I say, you know, I was almost 29, I would have been 28 and a half my life ago. You are closer to middle school years mm-hmm. than you are to me half of my life ago, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. And I'm not trying to make fun of you. I'm just saying, like, you're a kid, yeah. in general. But what that should remind us of is that pride doesn't necessarily come with a lot of money or a big mm-hmm. job or fame or fortune. Yeah. It seems to be a natural thing that slips up on all of us that every single person wrestles with in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for us. So how do you see pride manifest in other people's lives?
So, some that I've seen, and these are these are pet peeves of mine. Number one is difficulty apologizing. That has always driven me nuts. But that's a form of pride, right? You don't want to admit that you're wrong or that you've hurt somebody, because again, it all ties back to I have all the answers. And so people with difficulty apologizing, reluctant to seek help. People who are like, I got it 100%. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it right. Right. Other people's opinions help mold a project or an idea, especially in ministry. And so that's something I think that can really get you working in ministry, is reluctant to look for help or accept help. I think that's, personally for me, that's been one of the biggest ways that I've had pride in ministry, and I'm happy that I've gotten better at accepting help. And then the other one is taking credit, just claiming credit for team efforts and things like that. And I thought of back to high school, which, like you said, that's not too long ago.
A couple of years ago.
It's a couple of years ago, yeah. But the idea of people taking credit for team efforts and things that a lot of people put time into.
There are clear examples in culture where people's pride gets the best of them. And we could point fingers at everybody if we wanted to, in some form or fashion. But you and I are stage people. That's how I would describe it for the context of what I'm wanting to say.
Yeah.
Anytime you're on a stage, there is a tendency for people to give you way more credit than you deserve, view you as bigger than you really are.
Yeah.
And the challenge becomes keeping that in check. And I think that I think there has to be a consistent effort to keep our pride in check. Otherwise, it will get the best of us. The old proverb would be, you begin to believe your own press. You begin to believe you are as great as some people think you are, and that's a very dangerous place to be, because it can be expressed in so many ways that are unhealthy, and we have to be very careful about that.
There's a fine line between confidence and pride.
Yeah, confidence and arrogance is how I say it,
Sure.
and we don't know. I don't think you know when you become arrogant.
True.
It's
when somebody else puts you in check, you realize that.
Well, it's like sober and drunk.
Sure.
That's the example that I use most of the time. We know what drunk looks like. We know what sober looks like. But what we don't know is that line that we cross to become drunk. The same is true between confidence and arrogance. Confidence is necessary. Like there are some things in life you can't do without confidence. But you have to do without arrogance or pride.
Yeah.
And we know what arrogance and pride look like. We know what confidence looks like. We just don't know when you cross that line.
Yeah.
It's a very fine line.
I will say, I used to think this was a bad thing about me, but I realized later on that it was a blessing. I'm really bad at taking compliments. So the idea of, so if I have arrogance, it's self-made. Because it doesn't matter how many times somebody gets, hey, you did a great job. Hey, you sounded great on Sunday morning. I'm horrible at taking compliments and actually applying them to my own mind. So if I have arrogance, it's 100% self-made because I'm like, yeah, I did that,
Right.
rather than me being able to take a compliment. And I've seen that more of a blessing, because I'm already I couldn't have both. I couldn't have both myself, and then, like you said, what would you say? Press, like the pride and press, or whatever is how you said it. I don't know.
Pride and arrogance and confidence.
Sure.
Yeah. It would be how I would say it. Oh, you don't believe your own press.
Yes. That. So anyway, yeah.
I was trying to figure out what is he talking about.
What's he going
press
for right
what? Good.
Anyway, but yeah,
that's good. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation in the book of Exodus.